Hello everyone. In today's lecture, I will be trying to introduce the notion of partition as briefly as possible. And we see that partition is something that haunts our collective memory. And it is the Indianized version of an experience with the Holocaust. Holocaust is a term that is exclusively associated with the fate of the Jews around the Second World War. But we see that millions of Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims faced the same destiny, and their history never got highlighted the way that Holocaust history got highlighted. And so today we will try to discuss about those unsung heroes who were the victims of the Holocaust of partition. Before I move on to a detailed description, though there is not enough scope to give a detailed lecture on the online platform, but before I move on to a detailed description of the partition or what I intend to do in my presentation, I will just quote from Jawaharlal Nehru's 14th August 1948 speech, the Tryst with Destiny speech. In that speech, Nehru, I quote from Nehru, he is telling that a moment comes which comes but rarely in history when we step out from the old to the new, when an age ends and when the soul of a nation long suppressed finds utterance. On the eve of independence, this speech was delivered. But was India at all in a state to celebrate independence? Was India at all finding utterance to its long suppressed self of being colonized? No. Rather, India was struggling with the notion of trauma. We see that partition was like an encounter with trauma. La Carpa, Kathy Karuth, their trauma theories are already there regarding the Holocaust. But we need to develop an Indianized notion of trauma that we experienced during the time of partition. Millions of people were displaced, millions got killed, thousands and thousands got abducted and raped. And the notion of being rooted to a particular place was lost. We lost our roots, we lost connections with our ancestral homes. That was our encounter with the trauma of partition. And this trauma has got transmitted to later generations. I can say that to be born an Indian, to be born a Pakistani, or to be born in this subcontinent as a Hindu, Muslim, or a Sikh, you are as if born with a notion of the original sin. This sin that we are born with is the memory of partition. The memory of partition that has been captured and transmitted in and through the collective memory of a particular nation or culture. This is something that we have inherited in our tradition, the trauma of partition. And suddenly, within a day, two nations were born. And as two nations were born, suddenly a portion that used to be my homeland became an alien territory. And there was no option of going back. There was no option of crossing those barbed wires. The historical trauma of partition has to be considered in terms of the struggle for decolonization and the birth pangs of two nations of India and Pakistan, and the creation of, and the sudden creation, I should say, sudden creation of new national identities. The trauma of partition, it has to be examined in terms of the violence, in terms of the violence that were perpetrated on the woman's bodies. The trauma should also be explored in terms of religion that became a singular marker of identity in the midst of communal riots and migration, forced migration from Pakistan. Phantom trains were coming with an orgiastic display of slaughtered bodies, and the same was taking place as trains were going to Pakistan, to and from Pakistan. We see that such ghost trains were carrying thousands of dead bodies, and those dead bodies, on those dead bodies are imprinted the trauma of partition, and that trauma as a spectacle is still alive in our collective memory, is still alive in our collective memory. As I was talking of, suddenly a new nation was formed, or rather two new nations were formed, and it was quite traumatic. Why? Because there was a forced amnesia, in the sense you were forced to forget your homeland. The notion of home, the notion of roots were lost. And here I am reminded of Gloria Anzaldua's text Borderlands, and I will primarily quote a portion from Borderland that I remember. In the sense, I quote from Anzaldua, though it is in a different context. It talks about the Mexican border, but still, the quotation is extremely important as far as the notion of partition of India is concerned. Do not enter. Trespassers will be raped, maimed, strangled, gashed, shot. So what we see is that these are the concomitant acts of violence that are usually associated with acts of partition. And these are the traumas that we must live with pre and post partition. This is something that we can talk about regarding the historical trauma of partition. Now, I move on to a discussion of the fate of women and children during partition. Very briefly, I will introduce. We see that if we go back to Urvashi Butalia's text, or if we go back to other partition texts, primarily dealing with the history of partition, we will see that an approximate statistics is given that 75,000 to 1 lakh women were abducted. Many more were raped during partition. And we see that partition, it rendered many thousands of women alone It ruptured their life. And the sense of normalcy was lost. We must keep one thing in mind, that how partition is viewed by men and by women. And if we look at those perspectives, we will see that men essentially view partition in a different manner from women. And men are much more articulate regarding their experiences of partition. For men, partition was primarily the loss of the motherland. For men, partition was primarily the loss of family honor and all those things. But for women, partition was a palpable reality that was tattooed or imprinted on their collective bodies and on their psyche. There are certain horrific descriptions about how women got treated during the time of partition. But then we see that post partition, such narratives never came to the forefront. Why? Because of family honor, because of forced compromises. We see that those experiences of women, they were pushed to the shadows, simply forgotten. And we must be thankful to writers like Urvashi Butalia for trying to bring out those experiences to the forefront. And it actually shows the effect of partition on woman. Why? Because woman was considered to be a booty during the time of partition. Both parties or the opposite camps were trying to capture woman belonging to the other camp. It signified a sense of power. The rape and torture to which women were inflicted were not merely for the satisfaction of physical desires. Rather, it was a type of power politics where one race was trying to imprint its victorious mark, and in the process it was a type of humiliating blow to the manhood of the other race. It was like establishing your manhood as you raped women belonging to the opposite religion, or loss of manhood as you allowed your woman to be raped. So what we see is that in this struggle for reassertion of manhood, women were ultimately treated as chattels, and their subjective position always got denied. That has been the position of women from time immemorial. They have always been denied their subjective position, and they have always been the object of male gaze, male desire, male lust, and everything. And we are reminded of Dante Gabriel Rossetti's famous quote in the poem Jenny, where Dante Gabriel Rossetti tells that Jenny, looking long at you, the woman almost fades from view. Yes, the woman, her desires, her want almost faded during the time of partition, and she was mercilessly tortured, abducted, and sacrificed in this battle of religion, in this communal disharmony, in this power struggle. and blah blah blah. For woman, all those heavy sounding terms never mattered. Why? Because her experience of partition was absolutely different from a man's experience of partition. And the two nations were fighting over the body of woman. Even in partition literature, we see that the nation is represented as a feminine presence. But partition literature we will discuss later. But one thing that I need to discuss here is that the fate of children. We are primarily surprised that initially there was no mention to the fate of children during the time of partition. But as we must be knowing, partition rather created, and any partition creates, and partition of India created thousands of orphans, bastards, maimed and disturbed children with maimed and disturbed childhood. But unfortunately, India and Pakistan, they were busy fighting over their woman. Why? Because if I can control my woman, I can control the honor of the state, and the women were considered to be prospective, productive engines, but the children were not, and for that reason, the nations were silent. And there was also a doubt regarding the parentage of these orphaned and bastard children. Whose children? That was the question, and as that was an unsolved terrain, for that reason, these children always remained unclaimed and unsung. They always remained shadowy, and they were primarily forgotten. Now, I will briefly discuss the literature that evolved around partition. And we see that the literature that emerged after the period of numbness primarily records the feeling of unhomedness, rootlessness, unhomedness. And we see that this is a strange tropology of exile that made every writer write a sense of history that was already fading. And there is not enough time now left. We cannot discuss partition literature in detail. But we must note one point, that most partition narratives, they focused on the grand narrative of the country ravaged, torn asunder, wrecked, and that was a primary representation of partition literature. And partition literature was a parallel to the historical process. In the sense, partition literature was also trying to create a sense of one of the worst pogroms of or in human memory, and in trying to grapple with the enormity of misery, writers dealing with this period obsessively deployed imageries of violence, destruction, rape. And we see that in partition literature, history often lost its specificity, and history emerged as a timeless presence in fictionalized accounts. History emerged as a timeless presence in fictionalized accounts. This much I will say about partition literature. And now to conclude, to conclude, I would like to say that India's birth as a sovereign nation state was handcuffed to violence, bloodbath, and most importantly, migration of people from one side of the border to the other. The historiography of partition is constructed both in the historical and in the fictional level. This was a very brief lecture on partition. Thank you.